Hello and welcome to Chapter 4, Emotions and Moods. A lot of people don't think emotions and moods are important in the workplace, so we're going to discuss that. We'll talk about the definition of what emotions and moods are, and then the kinds of ways that emotions and moods can impact the interactions that you have. So in the past, really, we did not focus on emotions. We thought that they interfered with productivity. We thought they were disruptive. Managers actually worked to make the workplace emotion-free. We thought, you just check your emotional baggage at the door. I don't want to hear about it as a manager. I don't care about how you're feeling. Just sit down and do your work. That's what you're paid for. With recent research, we found that actually emotions can't be separated from the workplace. They're a part of who we are. They're a part of our human existence. That doesn't mean there's not individual difference about how emotional people are, and we'll talk about that. But it's simply not, it's just something that people can't do. You can't just tell somebody to turn off their emotions and not have them at work. So affect is defined as a broad range of feelings that people experience, and they're generally put into two different categories. So you usually experience affect either in the form of emotions or in the form of moods. So emotions are caused by a specific event. It's very brief in duration, so it's seconds or minutes. Generally, they're numerous in nature, so you can have a bunch of different kinds of emotions. So anger, fear, sadness, happiness, disgust, surprise. It's usually accompanied by distinct facial expression, and it's action-oriented in nature. So what does that look like? Well, let's say that you are walking home from work and you're walking in an area that's dark, it's not well lit, there's nobody around, and you start hearing footsteps behind you. It's a very specific event. This is likely going to happen over the course of seconds or minutes. I should be able to tell what kind of emotion you're experiencing, whether that's fear or surprise. And then, it's your body telling you to do something. When you hear about the fight or flight kind of reaction, that's what an emotion is getting you to do, right? Especially in this case. Are you going to run away from your attacker? Or are you going to turn and confront your attacker? Is it an attacker at all? You don't know, right? These emotions do things like increase your blood pressure, right? They get you ready to do something. Where moods are very different. They're often general and unclear. They last longer than emotions, so we're talking about hours or days. They generally have two different kind of categories. So positive affect, which is generally just being in a good mood. So if you know somebody who's positive and happy, we would say that generally they're high in positive affectivity. Doesn't mean that they can't have, times where they're not in a good mood, but just in general, they're high in that positive affectivity. Whereas if you know somebody who's kind of a Debbie Downer, then we would say that they're high in negative affect, right? They're gloomy, they're, always focusing on the negative side of things. So in a very kind of non-technical language, you can be in good moods or you can kind of be in bad moods, right? They're generally not indicated by distinct expressions, and they're more cognitive in nature. So it's more about you assessing your situation and then that's really leading to you feeling a certain way, as opposed to emotions are more reactive. They're more immediate. Moods are more, how's my job going? How's school going? How are my relationships going? Okay, well, everything seems to be pretty good. I'm probably should be pretty happy about this. So I might be in a really kind of high positive affect mood. There are 6 universal emotions, which are anger, fear, sadness, happiness, disgust, and surprise. We all feel these emotions, and what's interesting about this is that we are very good about picking up emotions on other people, at least these 6 universal emotions. So I could show you pictures, and it doesn't matter if the person is female, male, old, young, Chinese, Japanese, British, it does not matter. It's not culturally bound. We are very good about picking up these emotions on other people's faces. And people are very good about picking out these emotions on your faces. There's not a lot of things in really psychology where it's universal across all people. This is universal. We all experience these things, and they're all very easy to tell. We generally find that they fall on this spectrum or this continuum. So even though they are distinct and they are easy to tell, if they're closer to one another on the spectrum, you might you might take it for each other. So happiness might be taken for surprise, right? The line becomes a little bit more fuzzy, right? Where surprise might be taken for fear. But you're not going to mistake, happiness for disgust. That's not going to happen. So the further the way they are on the spectrum, the easier time you have of just, distinguishing them and making a correct sort of diagnosis about what is happening. So I'm going to have you watch this clip. Hopefully you will pause the lecture, watch the clip, and then come back, and then we will talk about it. This is a somewhat funny clip. It's one of those sort of hidden camera type things where somebody's sort of set up in a scenario that they think is real when really it's just a bunch of actors and you're there to sort of see their reaction. And I want you, when you're watching this, to think of, is the person here who's being sort of set up, are they experiencing moods or emotions? And how do you know it's a mood or emotion? Like, go through the checklist on, the second slide and say, okay, well, is it time bound? Is it short? Is it over a long period of time? Is it action oriented? Is it cognitive oriented? Go through that and really kind of ask yourself these kind of questions. Remember to access the links to go into the regular PowerPoints. Make sure that you're in full screen mode or presentation mode. So hit your F5, watch it, and then come back. So if we look at the structure of mood, it's more ambiguous than emotions, but sometimes we're able to pinpoint what might be going on there. And it's dependent on two things. One, is there a lot of energy that's being put into this, which would be high, or is there not very much energy being put into this, which would be low? And is it good or is it bad? So negative or positive? And that will actually tell us kind of where in this sort of wheel you would be. So if you have low amounts of energy and it's generally negative, you could be described as being sad, depressed, bored, fatigued. But if there's a lot of energy going into this and it's negative, I would describe you as probably being tense, nervous, stressed, upset. But if we flip to the opposite side of the wheel, if you have low amounts of this sort of energy, but it's positive, then I would describe you as being content, serene, relaxed, calm. But if it's positive and there's a lot of energy there, I would describe you as being alert, excited, elated, or happy. So hopefully you watched that last clip. And what's interesting there is we can see that there's high amounts of energy being expended, right? But when he thought it was a real scenario, we would say that it was high negative affectivity, right? So tense, nervous, stressed, upset, even though hopefully you came to the conclusion that there was more emotions being put out there. If we looked at him if they never told him and we looked at him over the next couple of days, we would probably see these kinds of moods kind of come out. However, the minute that he was told that it was a joke, that it was all a setup, then we saw, that instantly switched the sort of more alert, excited, elated, happy, which goes into why moods are more cognitive in nature, right? It was more about like, okay, haha, you spent all this energy, you set me up, this was good times, as opposed to I'm in a situation that I'm clearly not enjoying. So I want you to take a second and do an activity. So just like the other activities, it'll be about a page and a half, double spaced. I don't care so much about the format. Send it to me on Blackboard, and that'll be your activity for Chapter 4. I want you to list all the things that you think can impact your emotions and moods and why. So if you're in a funk, if you're in a good mood, what do you think puts you in that? If you have that fight or flight emotion, what puts you there? And why? Why do you think this impacts you? And then once you're done with that, I want you to think about your emotions and moods and how that impacts your work experience. So do you think it can make you more or less productive? Do you think it changes the quality of interactions you have with coworkers? Do you think it changes how you interact with customers? So tell me a little bit about what you think your emotions or mood impacts in the workplace and why. So hopefully you'll take a break, do this, and then come back because we're actually going to kind of discuss all of these things. So what impacts our emotions and moods? Well, first is personality. Some of us experience emotions very intensely, and some of us are more mellow, right? Things don't phase us as much. So we call that affect intensity. I'm pretty sure there's a test question on that. We just generally tend to find that through socialization or through genetics, that we just have a propensity to either take things as they come, things just sort of roll off our back. We don't experience these emotions very strongly, or they really can change our whole experience, right? We experience them very intensely, and that has a real impact on how we experience things. We do find that there's a time of day that we are most happy. So there's sort of a common pattern. We find that we're happy in sort of the midpoint of our daily awake period, and that it actually tends to decrease sort of after kind of the early morning hours. We find that we are happier towards the end of the week. So if you're happy, because it's Friday, that's a pretty universal experience. What's interesting is that they actually find that in other cultures that don't have a weekend like we have a weekend. We also generally tend to find that Monday is the day of the week that we are the least happiest. And again, that holds true for people that don't have that sort of Monday through Friday work experience. So that's pretty interesting. We actually tend to find, I tend to find that a lot of people report that weather have some sort of impact on their mood or their emotions. But if you look at the science, we actually find that there's no effect. So we call that illusory correlation, which means that we think there's a correlation there. We think that, it being gloomy out impacts our emotions or our moods, but it actually doesn't when we look at it. Stress can impact our moods. So even low levels of constant stress can worsen moods. So hassles, right? Somebody cutting you off when you're driving to school, not being able to find parking at school, little kind of pop quizzes. So we're talking about sort of low levels, not disasters, not major earthquakes, not deaths or divorces or, any of those things that can really cause high levels of stress. But even low levels of stress can worsen moods. We do find that social activities actually increase positive moods. So if any of you out there, when you're stressed out, goes and does something physical, something exercise based, if you go running or you go play basketball or you swim, that's actually a great way to increase your mood. It releases a lot of endorphins. It releases a lot of the feel-good chemicals in your brain. So being physical is actually a great way to put yourself in a better mood. Interestingly enough, they've done research that shows that being physical, doing physical activity can be just as good for helping depression as things like medication or therapy. So there's a pretty powerful physiological effect that this sort of, physical activity can have. We generally tend to find that informal activities put you in a better mood. So not super fussy, formal, dress up, gotta play nice with people, shake hands, kiss babies, kind of formal thing. But just informal, hanging out with friends, nothing super planned, nothing super fancy, that actually puts us in a good mood. And actually eating, especially with friends, increases positive moods. If you think about the last couple of things you did with friends, ask yourself, was food involved? Because we actually incorporate food into a lot of our social activities, and it really does have that sort of mood enhancing kind of quality to it, right? What do you do when you go on a date? Well, dinner and a movie. Well, there's something to that because it's putting us in this sort of better kind of mood. We do generally tend to find that sleep has an impact. So poor sleep quality actually increases negative affect. If any of you out there get cranky if you don't have enough sleep, and I'm raising my hand right now because I'm very much in that camp, that's based in science. So it's actually really important to get enough hours of sleep so that you're not in a bad mood, that it's not impacting the rest of your day. And if you are a college student, you are in that category of people that are chronically in that sleep deprived state. So, I know you're balancing a lot of things. You might work, you clearly go to school, you might have a family, you have friends, you have other obligations. And so I think a lot of times we tend to cut corners where we can. And a lot of times that's in sleep, right? But only getting 3, 4, 5, 6 hours of sleep a day is very likely to put you into this, funk, in this, not being happy, not being particularly satisfied. We talked about exercise. It does improve mood, especially for depressed people, which kind of gets into that physical kind of activity, which we already discussed. So age, this is interesting. I think a lot of people would not have this initial reaction. A lot of people think that as you age, people get more fussy, more cranky, more cantankerous. You sort of have the sort of visual stereotype of the older person who's just, not super satisfied with anything. But we actually find that older people experience fewer negative emotions. And a lot of that might be like, I've just been there and I've done that, right? Things don't faze me quite as much because they're not new. They're not novel. They're not like, you've been there, you've seen it, you've done that, you've got the t-shirt. Things just you don't just get ramped up as much as, maybe if you're younger. Sex, we do generally tend to find that there's a difference between males and females. We tend to find that women are more emotionally expressive. They feel emotions more intensely. They have longer lasting moods, and they experience all emotions more frequently than men except anger. So men tend to be more angry than females, but otherwise women are a little bit more emotional than men. So there's something a little bit true to that stereotype. But again, keep in mind that this is individual difference. There are women out there that are very, very not influenced by emotions, very steady, very calm. And there are men who are very emotional. So this being said, I'm talking about general patterns. It doesn't necessarily apply to any individual. So if you have ever worked any kind of job where you had to interact with customers on an extensive basis, so you've worked retail, you've worked food service, I always ask my students, what's the worst part of that job? And generally what I get back is people. And, people really can make a job really terrible. And what makes a job even more terrible, and you probably have experienced this if you've worked in any job that, again, there's a lot of customer interaction, is that you are told that the customer is always right? Service with a smile. You have to hide your real emotions and put on a happy face in order to provide a positive customer service experience. If you've ever done that, you've engaged in what we call emotional labor. So this is when you might hate the client, right? They might be being a jerk to you and you want to respond in kind, but you know that is not what your boss expects. You know that that's not part of your job. So what do? You stuff those emotions deep down inside you. You put on a grin and you bear it, right? You pretend that you care about their experience and that you want them to be satisfied, even when you kind of want to stab them with a pencil. So we say that emotional dissonance happens when you have to project one emotion when you simultaneously feel another. So if you remember when we talked about cognitive dissonance, when you have an attitude and a behavior that are not in alignment, this is very similar, where you have an emotion that's not in alignment with your behavior, right? So you hate the person, but you have to pretend that you like them and you want to help them out. If you've ever done a job like this for a long period of time, I find that people say that it is very emotionally exhausting. Like you come home at the end of the day and you just feel drained. And you haven't done anything super physical. It's not like you were particularly super busy. Just the experience of doing this emotional labor, hiding this emotional dissonance or experiencing this emotional dissonance can be very, very, very damaging. I don't find people are like, oh yeah, I did that job for 5 years and I loved it. Most people are like, man, I couldn't do it anymore. And that's that experience of burnout. If you've ever had a job where you were like, man, I would almost literally rather shoot myself in the foot than get up and go to work today, then you're experiencing burnout. And when people get to this burnout stage, generally they look for another job because they just can't take it anymore. Or sometimes they just up and change their whole career, right? Like, I'm just so burnt out being a nurse. Or I'm just so burnt out being an engineer. Or I'm just so burnt out being a lawyer. I just can't do this anymore. I'm going to go back to school and I'm going to be a chef. Or I'm going to be, just something else. I just can't even do my whole career anymore. So this really gets into this emotional dissonance. So we're going to, there's a difference between what you feel and what you display. right? So I hate the customer because they're yelling at me and it's nothing I did, but what I have to display is a required or appropriate emotion, which is usually concern or, service with a smile, or the customer is always right. Apparently at Disneyland, I've heard you can't say no to customers. And I don't know how that works, because what if a kid's like, "Oh man, take off your costume and let me wear it and run into the fountain." Like you can't say no at that point. But I have heard that you are not supposed to say no to people at Disneyland if you work there. So where does that lead you? Well, there's two ways that you can handle it. One is surface acting, which is that, again, just slapping on a smile, kind of grinning and bearing it. And we generally tend to find that that's really what leads to burnout. There is another way that you can handle it, which is what we call deep acting. And this is when you actually modify your inner feelings based on the emotions that you're having to express. So I think the best example I have with that is, like, let's say you're a nurse and you have patients and they're fussy and they're cranky and they're in pain and they're not super happy and maybe they're scared and that's causing them to lash out. So you're having to deal with these people who are not particularly always nice to you, right? So you could engage in surface acting where you put on a smile and you pretend to care about them. Or maybe if you have some sympathy from where they're coming from, you have some understanding that that's not who they are as people, but they're just in a scary, uncomfortable, painful situation. You can actually engage in this deep acting where you start to have sympathy, and that kind of helps match the kind of emotions that you're displaying. We actually find that deeper acting is harder to do. It's harder to have that empathy and have your emotions kind of match the required emotional display. But if you can get to that point, it's actually far less damaging in the long run. So emotional contagion is something that I find kind of interesting. And this is the idea, can you catch emotions and moods? So, hypothetical situation, you're in a really good mood, you're excited to come to work, you show up and your boss is just cranky, just upset, just angry, and is just lashing out at everybody and is just yelling. And it's not necessarily something that you did, but they're just very upset. Does that change your mood? Can you actually kind of catch their emotions? Does that put you in a funk, even though nothing bad happened to you, right? Like the boss might not even be mad at you. They're just in a bad mood and somehow that influences you. We do tend to find that this can happen, and it can happen both ways, right? You're in a funk, but you show up with your friends and they're super happy and positive, and that kind of impacts how you feel, right? You start being in a better mood just being around people who are in better moods. So yes, this does happen. Emotional contagion is a thing, but we do tend to find that, like a lot of things that we'll talk about in this class, that it's an individual difference. So some people are very susceptible to this emotional contagion, and some people aren't. So on an individual basis, you might be listening to this lecture and say, "Oh, that happens to me all the time." Or you might be listening to this lecture and say, that is something that I've never experienced. Like people's other moods don't impact me at all. And that's legit. That's something that the science actually supports. I can say personally, I'm super, super, super susceptible to emotional contagion. Like if I'm around fussy people, it doesn't even matter if they're not upset with me. Like it puts me in a bad mood. So I generally try and not be around people who are in bad moods. So I'm not in a bad mood. But other people, that wouldn't impact them at all. So I think the last thing we're going to talk about is emotional intelligence. So we talked about sort of cognitive ability, which is more sort of the traditional way that we conceptualize intelligence. But some people started questioning whether or not there were other ways that people could be intelligent. So, are there other kinds of intelligence besides book smarts? So this idea of emotional intelligence came up. So this is a person's ability to perceive emotions in yourself and others. So I've seen people where I was like, "Man, you seem a little angry." They're like, "No, I'm not." "Well, why would you say that?" It's like, "Oh, okay. Clearly you're not very you're not very connected with what you're feeling and how you're perceiving your emotions." Some people are just not super checked in. They're just not super aware. And if they can't tell their own emotions, generally they're not very good at telling others' emotions either. So we say people are higher in emotional intelligence if they're really in tune with what they're feeling, and also they're in tune with what other people are feeling. You also have to understand the meaning of these emotions. And then kind of even the more tricky part is you have to regulate your emotions. So if you're in a bad mood and you recognize you're in a bad mood, are you able to temper that experience so that you can get your job done or you can get through the day? And what's even harder is can you influence the emotions of other people? So you walk in, your boss is cranky, you realize that he or she just had a bad weekend, it's Monday, there's a lot of work to do. Are you able to manage your boss? Are you able to sort of put them in a better mood? I've seen people who are incredibly adept with that. They know exactly what their boss needs. They know how to sort of put them in a better mood. They know how to not anger them further. And that's a skill set, right? That's something that not everybody is adept at. So emotional intelligence is somewhat controversial and it's not wholly accepted. So we're going to talk about the people who believe in emotional intelligence, and then the facts that maybe would say that emotional intelligence isn't a thing. So the case for emotional intelligence is that it has a lot of intuitive appeal. Like, I get this. I see people who can do these kinds of things. So it makes sense as a construct. It makes sense as a thing that exists. Some research has shown that it actually does predict things that we care about. So there's some science to support this. And there does seem to be some sort of personality kind of basis for this, which would say that maybe there's a biological component. So these are all sort of arguments for emotional intelligence. On the flip side, we tend to find that researchers can't agree on definitions. So if you look at several people who are doing research on this, they might actually define it in different ways. Why do we care about this? Well, if we can't operationalize it, if we can't say this is what this is, then it becomes very hard to study. If it's kind of this, but kind of that, but kind of this, then you're trying to hit a moving target when you're trying to research it. And so that becomes really fuzzy, and it weakens the evidence that we have that would support that this is a thing. We also have really big problems on measuring emotional intelligence. The kind of surveys that we have just are not good instruments. It doesn't mean that this isn't a thing. It just means that we haven't figured out a way to capture it very effectively yet. And the problem is that, garbage in, garbage out. If we don't have good measures, if we can't figure out how to conceptualize this, if we can't figure out how to do research based on numbers on this, then it becomes something that's very hard to support with science. And then some people will say, well, this is just really personality, but with a different label. And we're going to talk about personality next chapter. So, maybe this is just one of those personality things that we're going to talk about. Maybe it's not its own thing. So those are sort of the arguments against emotional intelligence. So if you ask different people, they're going to give you different responses on whether or not they think this is a thing. Even within the College of Business and Public Policy. If you ask Frank Jeffries, he does research in this. He's totally into it. He will talk to you about it. Totally, is behind this as a concept. If you talk to me, I'm very numbers oriented. So I have a really hard time endorsing anything that we can't measure effectively. Again, I buy into it as a concept. I see the actual behavior. I think just as scientists, we have to get better at figuring out, well, how do we operationalize this? How do we measure this so we can support this as a thing that exists?